Cinqué Hicks is a writer and cultural producer, a prominent arts blogger since 2003. He is currently a visual art critic for Creative Loafing, Atlanta's largest alternative weekly paper. He has a BA in comparative literature from Harvard and a master's from Georgia Tech. He has undertaken research in urban informatics. What is that? He doesn't know, but he's got one. He's got a BA, urban informatics.
Too long of a story.
Okay, right. Catch him later. And digital media arts.
That I know what that is.
Yeah. He is now creative director and co-author of the new Possible Futures publication, Atlanta Art Now, and that's what he and Kathy and Jerry are going to talk about, right? Are you all going to jump in at some point?
If needed.
If needed. All right, thank you.
Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you to Flora Maria for hosting this gathering, and to the Contemporary for having us here. And I'm really happy to see so many people turn out, and so many kind of unfamiliar faces. I'm glad to see some fresh kind of faces that I haven't seen around. So that's really exciting to me, because I think it's part of the mission of our book that we're trying to accomplish, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but I'm glad to see such a great turnout, and I'm happy to be talking to you today. And also I want to say thank you to our volunteer for helping out, and for making us comfortable. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Really, the purpose of this talk is to sort of clarify and demystify a little bit the project that we're undertaking here, because I feel like it's a little bit of a new model. It's a little bit different, and so it's a little bit different. And so I felt that it really behooved us to get out into the public and talk about it, and let people know what it is that we're doing. And transparency really is a part of our mission, I think, in letting people have a real sense of what it is we're trying to accomplish. So today I'm going to be talking about just quickly some gaps in the critical landscape that we have all noticed, and the ways in which this book is a response to that, and a little bit about Possible Futures, which is the organization sponsoring this book, publishing this book, a little bit about the goals of Atlanta Art Now, the structure of Atlanta Art Now, and then a little bit specifically about what the 2011 edition of Atlanta Art Now is going to look like. One of the things I think, there was a meeting about a year ago at Emory that you were probably at, dealing with art criticism and some of the places where we felt that art criticism was lacking in Atlanta, and really sort of this is a national problem, a national issue. And one of the parts of that is a kind of sustained art historical engagement in Atlanta's contemporary art. And what I mean by that is, as opposed to the kind of journalistic writing that I, for example, do, and Kathy and Jerry do on a regular basis, one of the things that cities, for example, that have a university press, a robust university press, is the ability to publish on a regular basis, a sustained basis, real significant writing on an art historical basis about art in the region, or about just art, nationally and internationally, but specifically that identifies that region as a producer of interesting ideas in the contemporary art world. And that's something that we don't have here, unfortunately. So because of that, we don't really have that vehicle for producing those kinds of ideas in a visible, sustained kind of way. So that's one of the things that was brought up, I think, as a persistent need that we feel in this region. Broad internal, external visibility, that's something that's related. That's the idea of what can we produce here in Atlanta that has both internal recognition and external recognition. I think there are a lot of artists, there are a lot of curators, a lot of a lot of arts administrators, all of you, who have recognition within Atlanta, but then once you get outside of 285, you know, it's like there's a barrier there or a wall that's very difficult to cross. Or there are a lot of people that are nationally known artists and curators, but somehow internally in Atlanta there's no resonance, there's no vehicle to give those for an outlet for those kinds of efforts. So something that has kind of a cross internal and external kind of recognition, I think, was one of the things that we talked about in terms of what's missing in Atlanta. And then just the importance of print-based and persistent documents. I'm a big fan of the web. That's where I started. That's where my heart is in a lot of ways. But there is also something specific about print-based documents, the tangibility of them, the permanence, the persistence of them, that I think lends the writing a different kind of authority that I think is still important, that's still, if you will, the premier product in terms of writing. And so I think that those are some of the things that we were really thinking about. And I know that Kathy might want to jump in here.
I think that the first point, and the third point are intimately interrelated. And it's one thing to have sort of serial documents of daily occurrences or fleeting exhibitions, but I think there's a definite value in having a physical document that can be, as we're hoping to do, sent to curators in museums and other places. It does have, we're still, you know, the reality is print is disappearing, but emotionally and psychologically there is still a real credibility to that object. And I think we can take advantage with this document, and the fact that it's going to be a serial document is even more important, and obviously contributes to the building of a art history for Atlanta, which we lack, and which would be another great project to look back. And I think as we've been working on the book, we've all had occasion to do that, and just remembering what a rich history we do have is another thing that we don't understand among ourselves. And especially the younger generation is so energetic right now. I think might find it very interesting to know that they don't have to maybe they're reinventing the wheel, or maybe we need some new wheels, but it's good to know what came before. We need an archive. I think that our site, Burnaway, are providing that service right now in terms of free archive of what's going on, but I think the physical document is a very important addition to that.
And thank you all for bearing with this sort of little awkward arrangement. We weren't sure how many people were going to show up and exactly what the setup was going to be, so we're making it up as we go along, which is going to be a theme of my talk. So it's all, you know, we're just we're winging it as we go. Okay, so I mentioned that this book is being published by Possible Futures Inc., and many of you are familiar with Possible Futures, and if you're not, many of you are familiar with Louis Corrigan, the founder and board chair of Possible Futures. He started Possible Futures, actually I should know this, maybe about a year ago, something like that, as a way of being able to pursue some of these projects. Possible Futures is a private, nonprofit operating foundation, so not a public charity, but very close, like the Ford Foundation, similar kind of legal structure that is put in place in order to be able to fund some of these necessary, I think necessary, critical pieces of, critical projects in contemporary art. And then art criticism specifically is a major area that he and the organization have been concerned with. Specifically, he has already made 3 grants to area critical, well, to 2 websites, Art Critic ATL, which is the site that Kathy was talking about, to Burn Away, and then specifically to Jerry Cullum as a critic to do writing. So art criticism has been very close to the top, at the top of the list for possible futures, and this is an extension of that concern. Okay. It's a work in progress, like I mentioned, and we're figuring out the model as we go along. We're figuring out what this thing really is. I can say definitively that Atlanta Art Now is a series, and I say that specifically because it became apparent to me as I was talking to people that I needed to pull apart a little bit in people's minds. Atlanta Art Now, the institution that hopefully Possible Futures is building up, moving on into the future, versus the book of which I am one of 3 co-authors, which is 1 year, 2011, where we're going to be producing this one particular book, but that the institution will produce further books into the future. I hope that made sense. But we're setting up a structure in which books can be written in this serial kind of way, and so it is a series. One of the things that we want to achieve is the kind of internal and external visibility that I was talking about earlier. So a lot of our efforts are really aimed at how can we make this a vehicle for both for Atlanta and for an audience outside of Atlanta, and have that be the same vehicle. So, how can we write this in a way? How can we produce this in such a way that there really is relevance for both audiences? And that's, I think it's not necessarily a difficult thing to do, but it's something that we had to think about. It's not necessarily an obvious thing. So, so in all of our ways of approaching what we're doing, we are really thinking about both of those concerns. And also, this is related, an interface with Atlanta's contemporary art scene. How can, if you've just moved to town, you're a newbie in town, how can you find an entry point into Atlanta's contemporary art scene? Well, this can be one way to do that. If you are you're running a gallery in Chicago, how can you find a sort of way into the Atlanta contemporary art scene? Well, this can be one way, not the only way, but it can be one way to do that. So that's another purpose we hope that it serves. And then this needs to be a critical engagement of legitimate art historical importance. So, there are other publications that are done in this town. We're not the first people to do a book, but one of the areas that we're really stressing with this is this needs to be a legitimate piece of art criticism and art writing. This is not a promotional vehicle for artists. This is not as I said already in public, this is not something being put out by the tourist bureau. This is art criticism. And I think that this is something that the 3 of us as writers are very interested in. Now, I'll also say that it's no secret that Lewis and Possible Futures would love to promote Atlanta in a promote kind of way. But in terms of the work that we're doing, I think I can speak for all of us and say that we all take it very seriously as a research project, as an exercise in critical writing. And so that is absolutely the way we're approaching it. Briefly to go over the content of the book. an introduction where we'll be laying out some of the themes that we'll be talking about, and then thematic essays and reproductions of art. So, and we're working right now with a designer and figuring out exactly how those things are kind of going to go together. But my point is significant pieces of writing and then significant reproduction of art. So we hope that this is a nice package and a significant package in terms of a physical object and in terms of the writing that's involved as well. And then a foreword that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, and possibly some kind of epilogue or coda. We're still working on that. Briefly, just to kind of give you a sense of how this is organized as, how this is put together as an organization. There's possible futures, which I've talked about, and then the kind of the creative content side, and then more of the public side. And that's Orenike, who a lot of you, I'm sure, saw on the way in here. She's really managing that and controlling that process. So we have both parts of those covered. Okay. And the authors, we have Jerry, raise your hand, in case you don't know him, who is Atlanta arts writer, a long time Atlanta arts writer, and editor-at-large at Art Papers, and you just heard from Kathy, who's a co-founder of Arts Critic ATL and art critic for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and myself, I'm an art critic and arts writer for Creative Loafing, and once upon a time a blogger, and although that has not happened a lot lately, but still do the art writing at the paper. And we are going to have, as I mentioned, a foreword, and the person that we've talked to about that is Valerie Cassell-Oliver, who some of you may know as the senior curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, and was also the curator of the 2000 Whitney Biennial. And I mentioned that because that was the Whitney Biennial in which a relatively large number of Atlanta artists were represented, and that was due primarily to Valerie's advocacy for those artists. So she has a history with this city and with this region, and that's that is really the main reason that we approached her with this project and why she was ultimately interested in getting involved. I also mentioned that she was the co-curator of a fantastic pair of exhibitions at the Spelman Museum of Fine Art called Cinema Remix Parts 1 and 2. And if you didn't get a chance to see that, you really missed out. I mean, it was really, really fantastic with Andrea Barnwell Brownlee as well. And so she does have a history with this city, and she does know this city. She'll be actually coming into town in May to do some research, and she'll be visiting some artist studios, and then she'll be writing the foreword after that, and we're excited, I think, to see what she has to say. I mentioned Orenike. Is she? Orenike, can you raise your hand? She's back there. And she's really the public interface for this project. She's really the one to get in touch with if you have any questions about the project. She is managing our relationships with some outside people, and she's yeah, that's her position. Daniel Gaitan Beltran, who couldn't be here because he's ill right now, but he is the production manager of the book. Debbie Michaud, who said that she was going to try to come by, but I guess did not. Oh, there she is, yes. She is the content editor of the book. Ed Hall is the photo editor, and Elsa's design. I see David there doing our design and layout. Elizabeth, I think, couldn't make it, but it's a pair of them working on layout and design. So we've got a team together, and Daniel's really in charge of that production team, and so they're the ones putting together the actual book. And it's going to be printed locally. I think we have chosen a printer. Daniel has chosen a printer, but it was important that it be printed locally. We have an interdisciplinary advisory group, and the point of the interdisciplinary advisory group is to really try to help this project have some legs outside of the contemporary art, visual art community. I think one of the things that we see a lot in Atlanta is a real divided, a division between the disciplines, and that can be useful certainly in a lot of ways. But I also do think that cross-pollination is good for all of the arts. So we've got several people. I mean, you can see their names there: Nicole Jones, Beatrice Elzy, Michael Samanga, Charles Judson, Lane Shakespeare, and Susan V. Booth. And the goals for this advisory group at this point are fairly modest. We want to, get our feelers out there and get some differing perspectives on how we can imagine this book and where this book might be able to go and what it might be able to do. So this is one way of being able to hopefully accomplish that with these folks. Actually, are there any questions right now? Anyone have any questions? Okay. This is the website if you haven't already seen it. Not too much to point out here, just to say, if you haven't signed up for the email list, you can either sign up, I believe, back with Ornike on the pad, or just go to the website. There's a box where you can just put in your email address and join the email list. So just if you want to stay in touch with what we're doing, we'll email you, and we won't spam you too much. Actually, we probably will, but you can just unsubscribe if you get too many emails. So, okay. So to talk a little bit about 2011 and what we're thinking about for this year, what we're writing about for this year. You can read that, okay. We really started to talk a lot about place and about urban space, and a lot of this, came out of discussions that we were having about some of the discontinuities in Atlanta's urban space. Some of the ways in which the city itself is geographically divided and socially divided in so many ways. But I think pretty quickly kind of came to a sense in which we realized that may in fact be more typical rather than less typical of the way cities have begun to develop. And there are ways in which cities now participate in what Lewis actually came up with that name, I think, although it may have been Jerry, I'm not sure, but where we're interested in how places are defined by their lack of definition, where any airport waiting room or any freeway can pretty much be any other freeway or any other airport waiting room, and how that is in a lot of ways really constitutive of our experience of space in the 21st century. So this is the kind of umbrella idea that we've been exploring and thinking about and finding different ways into, and artists who are either specifically dealing with those issues consciously and directly or indirectly. are the kinds of artists that we're looking at and the work that we're looking at. So some of the related ideas are ideas of, I mean, you can see them here, global movement and utopia and disaster and discontinuity, as I mentioned before. I'm very interested in this idea of in-betweenness, specifically cultural in-betweenness. So, you know, this idea of people and peoples who are living in between different kinds of identities in one way or another. So those are, there's the kind of the bundle of concerns that we're thinking about and what we're going to be writing about moving forward. You want to say anything about that, Jerry?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of identity, in between this, it's cultural, and then there's an in-betweenness in terms of just the sense of the self itself. There's something about identity becoming far more provisional and fluid, as distinct from having earlier generations having created sort of intellectual and emotional opposition to dominant currents that have now passed into history. So, as you say, no placeness, and the very nature of our contemporary urban situation means that, you know, what I just said, there's a rise in the newer generation of a sense that the self and identity are fluid, open to negotiation in ways that a generation ago would have been inconceivable.
All I know is Jerry can write 2,000 words before breakfast, which I really need. So I think you have, you know, some idea of what we're trying to accomplish with the book. You know, we are taking this thematic approach, and like I said, this is a work in progress, and it's 2011. You know, I was in a meeting with Louis the other day, and he asked me, you know, did I really think that we could actually do this every 2 years? And when I say we, by the way, I want to be very clear that I mean possible futures. I mean they, every 2 years. And I said, I don't know if that's possible, but I think you have to proceed as though you will be successful, and you just have to go forward and go for it. So I'm really excited about it, and I'm glad to see so many of you out here and showing up today, because here we are, what, 7 months before the publication of this book, and already, you know, people I think are getting excited about it, or at least interested in it. So that's very heartening for me to see. And I'll say something. Kathy reminded me. She wanted me to remind you that this is not intended to be a kind of best of or top 10 or top whatever list of artists in the Atlanta area. It's not even intended to be, I mean, it's certainly not intended to be encyclopedic. It is intended to specifically look at a certain idea, and it is this idea of no-placeness. And we feel that a lot of artists are dealing with this idea, and they're dealing with it in very interesting ways. And so that's what we want to talk about. That's what we're good at as critics. We are not PR people. We are not. That's not what we do. So you know, I would not expect to be good at that. But we are critics, and we can talk critically about the work that artists in this region are doing. So you'll see that, you know, if you took one of the flyers on the way in that specifically is dealt with, because I think there is an automatic kind of sense, you know, an automatic assumption that what we're attempting to do here is point out all of the winners, and that is just so far away from what we're trying to do. Our effort here really is to engage in a significant, meaningful art historical way, and to look at interesting ideas and look at the artists that are pursuing those interesting ideas. And Kathy does want to say one thing. Okay.
That's why the idea of it being a serial publication is so important, because it's 3 writers with their perspective of a particular time. And 2 years from now, there will be 3 more writers with a different perspective and a different time and a different set of artists. And so I just hate, you know, I think that's really important to understand. That if you're not mentioned in this book, that doesn't mean you'll never be mentioned. And just to put it really bluntly, because I know artists care about that. And that really to reiterate that it isn't a compendium of the best artists in town. It's really a pursuing of ideas that artists' work has really announced to us.
Thanks, Kathy.
No, I'm just wondering if anything more should be said about the collective dialogue and how we really came up with the sub-themes. I don't know.
Do you have something specifically you want to say about that?
Well, just a footnote what Kathy said.
Just to footnote what Kathy said, that although we're writing separate essays about subtopics on no placeness, there was a great deal of collective dialogue before we decided what we would be writing about. So it really does represent our own perspectives on issues that we spent a very large amount of time discussing. And so basically what Kathy said is exactly right. There are physical limits to what a book can do. But as far as we're trying to make the concepts and the ideas as comprehensive within the chosen topic as possible, and chosen artist provisionally, which may yet change as we go along towards the final product, that would, as he said, represent the ideas and illustrate what really is being done in terms of these phenomena in our scene in 2011.
So, I think that is a pretty good summary of where we're at, and I'll just say thank you, and thanks for coming. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. And thanks.
Are you looking for trends in each year in art? Certain trends, thematic issues?
So the question was, are we looking for trends? I don't think so. I don't think that's the way to say it. And I'll say, first of all, everything you've heard from me, from my mouth, is my point of view, which is not necessarily Kathy's point of view always, and not necessarily Jerry's point of view. I mean, I think they've piped in when they feel like they need to say something, but we certainly don't see everything the same way. So there's a, I think there's a dynamic and interesting tension among the three of us that I think helps the book. So to answer your question though, I don't think that we're looking for trends. I think that what we are looking for are interesting ideas and interesting art and interesting work. I don't think, I mean, we're not looking at it in that sort of sociological way. What we're interested, I mean, we have things we're interested in. We have ideas that we think about. And those are the kinds, and that's what we're pursuing. So it's not necessarily, I mean, I don't think that we, for example, would sit here and say somehow, this idea of no placeness is somehow the trend of Atlanta, or this is what, represents the largest number of working artists or anything like that. It's just that it's an idea that we're interested in. It's an idea that we think is important to think about, and relevant. So I think that's the way to think about that. I think we had one hand here, and I'll get to you.
The idea of no placeness is fascinating because my own experience of being in Atlanta 13 years is exactly that. And so I've also been doing research on community and what community is and how community functions, both in terms of singularities, individuals, and collectives. So that idea of no placeness also seems to foreground the idea of community, which from my experience in this community has been the dispersal of artists and intellectual ideas, and that the coming together is very difficult and problematic because of geography, principally, and to some extent fiefdoms, and sort of a cultural heritage that I believe Atlanta owns. Are you addressing some of those ideas in the context of no placeness?
So the question was, I'm not going to quite get all of this, but basically that the idea of no placeness seems to foreground the idea of community and the problematics of community in Atlanta, and how difficult our history has been in terms of bringing together dispersed artists, thinkers, intellectuals, and I guess just people in general, and partly because of the geography and the history and XYZ, all the reasons that we all know very well. And are we thinking about that? I think the answer is yes. We are thinking about that. I know Jerry specifically has a lot of thoughts about that. So that is something that we're thinking about. But I also am thinking about the way in which that's a typical that Atlanta is not alone in that. That there are cities, possibly increasingly around the world, that deal with a lot of those same issues. I mean, I think we have a particular flavor of it here that's like a particular Atlanta sort of no placeness, but Atlanta is not the only town. Houston, yes, Houston is a great example of that. But really, there are degrees and kinds of no placeness everywhere. That for me, anyway, is something that I'm interested in. Is to what extent maybe is place a different concept in 2011 than it might have been even in 2001, much less in the last century. So yes, I do think some of those issues are specific, relevant to this city, and we will be talking about in our various essays, and I think it's also relevant to a lot of places. You have a question?
Just a point of information, Valerie Cassell will be honored at the Driscoll dinner, April 16th.
I meant to mention that, yes. So Valerie Cassell Oliver was recently honored with the David Driscoll Prize by the High Museum, and she will be in town when? April 16th. April 16th. And is that a public dinner? Is that open? Can people buy tickets, or is that?
It's an annual gala.
Oh, okay. It's an annual gala, so that does mean tickets are available. But coincidentally, I mean, it was just a sheer coincidence, actually, that we were also talking to Valerie at the same time. And she said, in the last closing discussions that I had with her, she mentioned that there was some big thing that she couldn't tell me about, but that that was going to happen soon. So, so I was waiting for that. But yeah, so we have both tapped into her real intelligence and her concern, I think, also for this city. Any other questions? Yeah.
Excuse the gross oversimplification, but what is the readership, the suspected readership for this? Because in general, I feel like a lot of Atlanta writing, well, not necessarily art papers, but something largely associated with Atlanta, and a lot of other things are a little more geared towards an everyman or an art beginner versus like a restricted audience that maybe art form or something usually elevated would be a term for it.
Right. Okay, so this is a kind of a delicate thing, I think. So the short answer to your question is that we wanted to write for people who I think care about art and know about art. I think that this is not, I mean, we all do writing for more general audiences. I certainly do it at Creative Loafing. I, at least, am looking at this as an opportunity to write I mean, you use the word elevated. I don't know if I'd use that word, but in a more sophisticated way. You know, for people who are thinking seriously about art, and I think that that's important. First of all, for this city. I mean, where do you go after you exhaust all the sort of general readership kinds of things? There needs to be something for people who want to take the next step and read something very interesting. You know, something engaged. So yeah, that's I think where we're writing this, and so it is for artists and art students and curators and collectors and, you know, anyone who's interested in contemporary art. But yeah, I do think it's important to have. I think it's important to have in any creative ecology materials that are available all up and down the food chain of interest. There needs to be something at all of those levels. And so I think that by providing specifically, you know, writing about Atlanta artists, about this city, about this region, that's, you know, sort of aimed at a more, there's not a good word for this, but sophisticated audience, that's filling a need.
And then the last question is, you know, you've said it's not a best of, it's not a top 10, but isn't there inevitably an implicit critical endorsement of the artists you select to include?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, I don't think it's worth writing any kind of sort of art historical or archival, whatever you want to call it, of artists that you think are terrible. So, so yes, you know. So that's to answer that one. But you had a question about distribution. So let me answer that one first. How are we doing on time? Are we okay with that? I don't know. But to answer your question about distribution, that's being worked out. You know, it'll be for sale. It'll be on Amazon. It'll be through the website. It'll be we'll be sending out copies to people. We'll be doing the usual sort of book kinds of marketing things. There may be a couple of sort of museum store type sales, but that is far from a known thing. You know, like I said at the start of this, this is the first time out. I expect that we will get a lot of things wrong, and then we'll look back and say, oh shit, we should have done that differently. You know, oh well. You know, so that's being worked out. In terms of art criticism and art history, I think we could. Did everybody hear the question, first of all? Did I repeat the question? Okay, the question, he had two questions. The question was, how are we distributing this? And then the second question I'll summarize as we mentioned an art history project, we mentioned this as an art criticism project, and we mentioned this as an archival project, and those are not all three the same thing. So what do we really mean by that? What do we really intend? And I'll answer, you know, and similar to the way I answered the first one, which is we're doing what we are good at, which is writing about artists. And I would disagree with you that art history and art criticism are that different. There is a great deal of overlap and bleeding back and forth between those two. James Elkins, who I'm sure you know, has a lot to say about this, about how any division between art criticism is ultimately a narrow way of looking at one or the other, that essentially these are really the same thing. So I don't know if I go that far as to say they're the same thing, but I know that I write art criticism, and so that's what I plan to do. 5 years from now, that will be art history. So that's a different, so it, you know, that living document, I think that's part of the purpose of it being a living document, is that it has some persistence. in that it becomes a document that can be referred to 5, 10, 20 years from now. We hope, if we're successful at what we do. And then I believe Kathy was the one who mentioned archive, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you mean that this 2011 edition will be the archive. I think what we're trying to say is that and again, we as Possible Futures. So Possible Futures is attempting to create a long-term project, and that this is a structure into which a lot of things can be put. The way I would think of it is that Possible Futures, through this project, is attempting to create an archive, and this is the first book in that archive. It's just one book. We're not trying to say this is all of Atlanta, we know everything about Atlanta. It's just one book. And so what we want to do is the best job we can do with this book, and hope that that project builds on itself, and that other books will follow behind it.
Great.
The meeting today, what do you hope to achieve with the meeting and bringing together everyone today to really kind of hear about this?
What I hope to do is to open this process up to some transparency. I think that a project like this can be easily misunderstood and misapprehended as to what we're trying to do, and I think it's important to clarify our intentions, and to clarify Possible Futures' intentions. And I know I'm kind of going back and forth a little bit on that, but I want to make it clear that I'm not an employee of Possible Futures. I don't work for Possible Futures. I am working on a project of Possible Futures, a project being funded by Possible Futures. So, so I apologize if I've been a little lax in who I'm referring to. But I know that Possible Futures is excited about the idea of this being an ongoing project that can really serve this community. And so I think it's important for people to be aware of that as close to the beginning as possible. Any other questions?
So, talking about transparency, there's some expenditure laid out for all of the editions that are going to come out in 2012, 2013, 2014. Are you all set aside as clearly?
No. There's money for this edition, and that's it. This is a pilot project. This is let's see if this floats. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, has money been laid out for future editions for 2013, for 2015, et cetera, et cetera? And my answer to that was no. There's money for funding the 2011 edition, and that, believe me, was already a big deal. And so, and I'll reiterate that this is a pilot project. And we will see how this goes. Possible Futures will see how this goes. And if it's something that people respond to and people think is important and interesting, it will likely continue. But in terms of if there's already a check written, certainly not. Certainly not. Lisa.
I just want to make a comment again just see if I'm out of sight. But I first of all want to say how excited I am about this idea, and it's because as many of us in the room have been in the arts community in Atlanta for a long period of time, and have always bemoaned sort of the lack of art history. I think that MoCA was a move towards that. I mean, seeing all the incredible shows that have happened at the Contemporary and Nexus and Hammond's House and all the projects and the Arts Festival, all the things that have happened over the years that have kind of come and gone. I mean, it's just fantastic to see that, I used to say that there was no art history, that Atlanta had no art history, because there wasn't, there was episodic and really great writing that was happening, but it was sort of appear and disappear, so that idea of a persistent kind of vehicle for that is great. But I also want to applaud your courage in doing this in some ways, because I know it may not be that you're doing it courageously, but that whole thing, there's been such a great void of this and sort of a lack of attention. You know, there's so much feeling in the community that artists and people who've worked for years and have done sorts of things have sort of lacked attention. And writing, you know, particularly from the major art centers and major publications, that of course you're going to encounter a lot of, well, what is it and why aren't I included and what you know, that sort of thing. So I know you're probably hearing a lot of that anxiety from everyone, and I just, you know, I think that, anyway, I just want to applaud you for taking that on and just to say that, you know, I think it's just going to, it sounds like a really interesting project.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Lisa basically just said that she wanted to applaud us for taking this on, and that she thought that I was incredible and fabulous. And she also mentioned, I think, a history in Atlanta of feeling that there's a lot of great episodic writing, but not necessarily, well, the phrase you used was that Atlanta has no art history. And so something that tends to work against that hasn't
been being fixed in, you know, recent years. I mean, lots of things, but, you know, not, you know, and it's happened in various, and certainly this isn't the first effort, of course.
Right.
You know, but anyway, just to hear it being thought about very thoughtfully and done in a very a real thoughtful way, I think it's just a really good next step for us.
Well, thank you, thank you. And I do want to pick up on something you just said, that this isn't the first piece of writing or book to come out of Atlanta. I mean, we're certainly aware of that. I hope that you all are aware of that. We want to add to that. We want to add more voices to that. We want to add a different spin on it. We want to add more. I think there's room for lots of different kinds of voices. And so we're attacking certain parts of the issue and certain problems and certain gaps, and other people will deal with other issues and other gaps that we won't deal with. So I think that we are looking at this project as a supplement to other kinds of writing and efforts that have come out of Atlanta.
I was going to say, you know what? I don't know what's become of all those books you're talking about Atlanta. They seem to have just disappeared. So that's something to think about this book, and you know, in terms of the audience, in terms of the presence, because I can't name a single one. Can you that has addressed the community and the art history of Atlanta artists? I can't think of one.
Well, I can.
Okay, please.
Yeah, I can we can talk about that afterwards. But I think your point is well taken, which is that there is a possibility of this kind of thing sort of disappearing, in your words, and that we need to think about that carefully and guard against that, I think, or do what we can to sort of make sure this doesn't sort of disappear into the ether. So I think the point well taken, that's definitely something we need to be thinking about.
And maybe just in terms of funders, continuity, that it needs to continue. It can't just be one, because that's what's always happened, and that's why I don't remember them.
And she's also mentioning that that continuity is important, that having just one edition that's what kills, I guess, these sorts of efforts, and it would be a shame to have only one, and it's important to, I think we all agree with you that we'd love to see this this happen.
Understood.
Yeah.
Step up.
Yes. Question here.
I'm actually interested too in finding out what those other things were, because there is that lack of continuity, and continuity between this instance of this book and other instances of this book is obviously great. But, you know, where can the continuity be drawn maybe between what has already come to help us sort of maybe feel more linked with that past, because it seems like our art scene suffers from that very no-placeness that the theme is that it's a big pool and something goes in and makes ripples, and then the ripples are gone, and you know, each plunking of things isn't sort of being networked together.
So the question was, or the comment was that you also are interested in hearing what some of those previous books have been and how things can kind of plunk into a big pool and then disappear after a certain time. And, I don't know the mechanism by which things disappear. I mean, if I thought about it hard enough, I'd probably, I'd be able to come up with something. But I mean, I think what's important to stay focused on is that what we're trying to do is create a structure. We're trying to do two things. We're trying to create a structure that's compelling and that a lot of different kinds of ideas can fit into. So I think that if we are successful in creating that, if we're not successful in creating the structure, then one possibility is that it was the wrong structure, in which case it shouldn't be done again. If it's successful, if it is compelling, if people find it of value, then yes, I think it should continue, and hopefully it will continue. But our real effort here is to lay the groundwork, is to do exactly that, is to lay a groundwork for a continuing structure. And I think that can be supported in all sorts of ways with website and different kinds of continuing conversation, things like this, forums like this. But I do think that, I mean, again, your point is also well taken, that I think that is something that we need to have foremost in our minds.
Obviously, you can't do everything all at once.
Right.
But I would like, if this structure sort of takes, it would be interesting to maybe pull some of the past threads kind of into it and at least tie them off where they can be followed.
So the comment was, is there some way of building on or tying in some of those previous efforts that we've talked about? And I think that's something that I'll take back to Possible Futures and discuss with them. Let me get yours and then yours.
I know you decided on having a physical paper book, but did you do an analytical analysis of whether to go, say, to an internet version versus the book, or did you just kind of decide on the book?
I was brought into the project after that decision had been made. So there may have been some decision of, or thinking about that at some previous point, but I know that Lewis, the founder of Possible Futures, the question was, had there been any thinking about doing an internet or digital version versus doing a book, or what was the thinking behind that calculation? And I was saying that I was brought into this project after that decision had already been made, and but I do also know that Lewis, the founder of Possible Futures, is really concerned about print products. He's concerned about physical, tangible objects and their ability to persist, and their ability to function in a socially in a way that is socially different from digital media. Not to say better or worse, but that is different, and that is still necessary. That was, I believe that was the thinking behind why it's a book specifically.
I'm just going to comment, because the connection to the history and historical, I think that it will just come. It will just come as you embark on the project and through the writing itself. That will just happen. And to Lisa's point, and I agree with her, it's just a great undertaking, just to give us the voice, to use the words, to elevate through your creative writing. I think it'll be a very exciting opportunity to really help our community by having that, just at least to start it and to try to get that, to try to begin that dialogue. So we really applaud you for that.
Thank you. So she was seconding some of Lisa's points earlier about being excited about the undertaking, and also saying that she thought that some of these connections that people are worried about may take care of themselves to a certain extent. That if we do this writing, that these kinds of connections will happen. We'll see. We'll see. I would certainly. I would be excited if that happened. I'd be excited if that happened. Any other questions?
I just want to encourage all three of you to embrace your role as promoters and tastemakers. I know you're trying to keep distance from that, but you have to agree the success of the volume rests upon your criticism being seen as relevant in the wider art historical world, but also upon the people you choose being successful. If you choose artists that matter who are perceived as successful, the book will be successful. So you are promoters, and I think you just not be shy about embracing that.
So the comment was that we should embrace our role as promoters and not shy away from it and not pretend that we're doing anything other than that. Well, I mean, you and I might see that differently, but again, point is taken. That the success of this book depends on the success of the artist and vice versa. Maybe maybe not. Depends on how you define success. I mean, I would say, I guess, that I will feel like my job is done if I do a solid piece of writing and it is a good, it's a good contribution to art history or art criticism, or whatever we want to call it. But to art writing. But it's, yeah, I mean, and if the book is also a success in whatever way we define that, I mean, yeah, that's important too. That's important too. So that's, again, a point well taken.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, and actually Jerry sort of asked my question, which is, if the appearance of future books is contingent on the success of this book, how will that success be measured?
Yeah, and that's a question that Orenike has, pushed as well. And I think it's a good question. It's something that we need to figure out and have metrics for and come to some decision about. The short answer is don't know. We will. That's something that we'll be thinking about and working on as time goes by.
But can I just make a little comment?
Yeah.
I think there are models for that, though, and I think actually, maybe think about what other. I can't think of any Atlanta books, I swear, but I can think of one that was sort of somehow based here, which was Conversations in the Castle and Mary Jane Jacobs' project in Charleston. And I think that book is still a valid book. I think it's a very interesting book, and I think people still go to it. And how many years old was it, Rebecca? It's like at least 15 years old, right?
Yeah, right after the Olympics.
Yeah, it was the Olympics. It was the Olympics. So, and I think that actually addressed the community. I mean, if there weren't local Charleston artists per se, no, that's there. But there's something powerful about that book.
So there's bringing up the point that there have been models before, that Conversations in the Castle, good models before, and that might be a way to measure or to figure out relevancy, success, those kinds of questions, which I think are very important.
We still have boxes. Elisa has boxes.
Elisa still has boxes.
Fred Moran,
yeah. Okay, so I think we need to wrap up, but thanks again for coming, and please stay in touch with us, and have a good evening.